Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5.
The astronauts from the glory days of NASA's Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo space programs were more celebrated than movie stars, more idolized than sports heroes. For them, only one car truly possessed the right stuff, the Chevrolet Corvette.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
In July of 1969, NASA delivered on President John F. Kennedy's audacious pledge.
I'm going to step off the limb now.
Landing Americans on the moon before the end of the decade.
Oh, geez, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent?
I watched it all as a starstruck boy, these giant leaps in human history, and the joy and wonder I felt then has never dimmed. So join me as I revisit the shrines of the American space race, behind the wheel of America's most iconic sports car, and in the company of a bona fide NASA legend who in 1968 launched atop a Saturn rocket as part of the greatest adventure mankind has ever known. This beautiful 69 427 Big Block once belonged to Alan Bean, who as lunar module pilot on Apollo 12 became only the fourth human being to walk on the moon. Bean's crewmates had matching black-on-gold Vettes of their own. Today, this car, bearing initials for Lunar Module Pilot on its flanks, is the only one of the three that remains. Then there's this 2005 C6, owned by an original astronaut who's still driving Corvettes. Civilian Walt Cunningham, an ex-Marine fighter pilot, was selected for the third group of NASA astronauts in late 1963. And went on to fly aboard one of the most watched missions of them all. In 1968, Cunningham spent 11 days in Earth orbit aboard Apollo 7, the crucial first flight of the Apollo program and the first manned launch since the devastating Apollo 1 fire. Walt agreed to meet me at Kennedy Space Center near Orlando, Florida, to show me a thing or two about his old stomping grounds. Of course, it didn't hurt that he'd also have a chance to get his hands on my brand new 2014 C7 Vette. All right, Walt, we're here at Kennedy Space Center in the Rocket Garden, and we're standing next to a Saturn 1B. This is the actual type of rocket that you flew on Apollo 7.
Yeah, this is the only remaining one that I know is on display. So it's always a pleasure for me to be down here and take a look and just see a Saturn 1B still left.
How does it feel to look up at this monster and say, I rode this in 1968?
I now am impressed. In those days, it was something I just took for granted. You know, we was going to fly whatever vehicle was out there, we were going to go fly it. And now I come back and I can appreciate, the significance of it.
So this is the first stage here that would fall off after you...
Yeah, from here on down, that would come off. That's separated because there's engines for the Saturn 1B. The service module engines are inside right here, and so that was very important for us in orbit. When you got off the elevator and started to cross this crosswalk here, we knew we were going to get in the spacecraft, and there was a good chance we were going to get launched.
5, 4,
So this is just a command module mock-up, but it's the right size. And
It is, for all intents and purposes, the vehicle.
And you spent 11 days, 3 of you,
Yes.
in orbit in something the size of a
Yes.
large sports car inside.
Yeah, we got a little bit at each other's throat once in a while, but that's awful close.
Were you able to sleep in space very well?
By the third scheduled sleep period, I could sleep, very well. Zero gravity is the part getting used to. What happens is you're about ready to go to sleep. You're inside a little bag just to keep you from floating around. And about the time you're about ready to go to sleep, all of a sudden you're falling. I mean, you feel like you're falling.
Just like we all do when we're dreaming.
Right, right. So all of a sudden you're awake again.
Very comfortably inside the net.
So Walt, this is the actual NASA van that took you and your Apollo 7 crewmates to the launch pad, took all the rest of the Apollo astronauts to the launch pad. Do you remember which seat you sat in?
I can't imagine anybody remembering things
Really?
like that.
You don't?
No. This was just a way to move us to the next step. You know, I think all of us were probably focused on one thing only. It says, don't screw up.
In an incredible stroke of luck, we managed to catch one of NASA's crawler transporters out and moving. Even Walt has never seen this thing in action. These huge rigs, which weigh 6 million pounds, carried the Apollo rockets from the vertical assembly building to the launch pad. And given that there are only 2 of them, there's a 50% chance that this very crawler carried Walt's Apollo 7 rocket to its pad. So what was it like when you finally got out here on launch day?
Well, you get out there on launch day and you're focused on, you know, getting out of the trailer, getting in the elevator, up and into the spacecraft. And all you want every step along the way is things to go smoothly.
But for you, all your years of training, all the tenseness of getting into the program, is about to pay off on the pad.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it was 3 days shy of 5 years after I had become an astronaut. And all of that was involved in training of one kind or another. Okay, Art, I've shown you everything that I used to do. Now what are you going to show me?
Well, Walt, I have the favorite ride of America's astronauts. I've got the Chevrolet Corvette. In fact, I've got the all-new 2014 C7 Corvette. How'd you like to drive this bad boy?
I'd like to try it.
I'll bet you would. Let's do it. As if today hadn't already been epic enough, that evening we walk out to the beach in front of our hotel just in time to watch the launch from Kennedy of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. Yep, some days are just better than others. So Walt, take me back in time. It's the early 1960s. Here you are, you're a Marine fighter pilot, and suddenly you decide, I want to be a NASA astronaut. What was that like?
Well, as a pilot, of course, I always wanted to fly higher, farther, and faster. But I'll never forget on May 5th, 1961, I was driving over the Santa Monica Mountains to where I worked at the Rand Corporation, a little before 7, and listening to Alan Shepard's launch.
The first American in space.
And after I listened to that, listened to the liftoff, that was the time that in my heart I decided, you know, I am going to do that if at all possible. And months later, I ended up being one of the 14 they ended up selecting.
How many people applied for those 14 places?
Well, there were 770 qualified applicants, and some pretty good guys didn't make it, incidentally, for a variety of reasons. So I really felt fortunate that I was one of the 14.
And so your 14 joined the first 2 astronaut groups, so there's a total of 30 astronauts now. And several years later, 1968, you joined the 3-man crew of Apollo 7, the first Apollo flight to lift off.
Well, there were 30 of us when we first reported down there, 30 of us total. It wasn't too long before we started losing a couple, lost them in some airplane crashes. Before long, we were down 27 or 26. And eventually I was placed on actually the prime crew for a flight that never went. It was called Apollo 2. And we backed up Apollo 1. When they died in the fire on the pad, we inherited the first mission, which they then renumbered, and we ended up being Apollo 7, the first flight in Apollo.
Well, Walt, before you became an astronaut, you've always been into sports cars, but you were kind of into foreign sports cars. Once you joined the astronauts, though, they're all Corvette crazies, weren't they? And you became one yourself.
One of the reasons that I became crazy was I found out that through a dealership down in Melbourne, Florida, that I could get a very special deal with Corvette at the time, so I could afford it. I couldn't afford it before, so I got my first one was a 1964 C2, I think it was at the time. I liked it a lot, but after the good deal ran out, I ended up going back and forth to some other cars too. So over the years, I've had a variety of different cars, including Corvettes. And then after going through all these cars, I switched back to Corvettes again in 2005. It's like the car is getting better and better, and it's reasonably priced. Really a wonderful automobile for the price you pay for it.
Yeah.
Ah, New Orleans. Last time we came here, we partied hard and woke up feeling like death. This time, the same thing, but we had an Apollo astronaut with us. But there are NASA sites here too. So Walt and I board a boat and hit the water in search of the Michoud rocket facility, which in the 1960s and early 1970s constructed the huge first stages of Apollo's Saturn I and Saturn V launch vehicles. Well, Walt, we can't see a whole lot from here, but this is the vertical assembly building where they made the first stage. They put it up right.
This is where they stacked them up and got them everything just right, and then they would have to take them horizontal and get them out here so they could put them on a barge and go as much as possible in the passage all the way down to Cocoa Beach. So that is the what we would call the vertical assembly building.
And then that piece would make it to the vertical assembly building that we saw at Kennedy Space Center, and be
it would be just the first stage.
Yeah, and just put together with the other stages, and we'd have a finished rocket. For casual cruising around, New Orleans has a never-ending stream of fascinating sights. A so-called steamboat house near the Mississippi River, the last battleground from the War of 1812. Frady's funky one-stop food store, and then the front entrance to the Michoud rocket plant. You can't believe how big the first stage of a Saturn V rocket is until you've seen it in person. Next stop, the Johnson Space Center in Houston, about 350 miles from New Orleans. Before I visit the home of Mission Control, though, I dropped by the house of good friend Bruce, a Houston resident, Corvette crazy, and owner of some of the choicest vintage Vettes and auto memorabilia you'll ever see. Why don't you take me through what you got out here today?
Sure, yeah. This is a 61. It's a second generation Corvette. It's a 283 cubic inch engine, 2 4-barrels, 245 horse. 63, that's one of the crown jewels of collectible Corvettes. It's the first year of the Stingray body style, and it has a split window in the back.
Which makes this a real collector's car. Now tell me about this monster right here.
Yeah, this is the one we call the Beast. This is 67, big block 427, 435 horse, side pipe convertible, just about devoid of options. No one wanted to rob the rear wheels of power back in 67. Had to have the sister to this one. This is the opposite. It's a small block V8, 327, 350 horse, power steering, power brakes, factory air, and this is the one that my wife particularly likes. And this is a third generation Corvette. It's a 350 cubic inch small block. It had the LT1 option group.
And didn't you tell me this is original paint on this car?
This is an original paint car, original interior car.
Unreal. And then of course, Danny, you brought your spectacular Astrovette. You know, this car is too valuable to race, but I've kind of reserved some runway time at Ellington Air Force Base.
Yeah, sure.
Would you bring this out there?
Oh, yeah.
And Bruce, you're 427. I know they're rated at 435. It's probably making well north of 500, I'm betting. Would you like to drag race that against my C7?
I think that could be arranged.
Bruce trusts his precious cars to only one man, Ray Rosinski, who just might be the best Corvette mechanic in the entire US of A. Ray is one hell of a driver. And he wasn't babying that big block. But even with all that horsepower, he had to deal with 60s era tires, a finicky clutch, and a suspension that darts around over every crack in the pavement. In comparison, my C7 made my runs a walk in the park. Danny, this beautiful 69 you've owned since 1971. This is Alan Bean's personal Corvette. He was the lunar module pilot on Apollo 12, the fourth human to walk on the moon. What does it feel like to own a piece of astronaut history like this?
I love owning a piece of history, and it's opened so many doors. You know, it's like meeting astronauts like we have again today, and getting to tour NASA, meet a lot of people, and it's got a better life than I do. The car tends to go a lot of places.
And you actually rescued it. It was kind of lost to obscurity for a while. Then a couple of years after Alan Bean was done with it, you found it.
I bought it from General Motors through GMAC, and I did find it on a lot, and I recognized it from a Life magazine article. I feel very blessed to have it.
The Apollo 12 crew had 3 matching Corvettes. This
Yes,
was Bean's, and then the other 2 guys had their own, and the other 2 are gone.
We haven't been able to find them. Of course, they could be in a barn somewhere.
They could be, but
you never know.
But meantime, what is a car like this worth? Like, it must be astronomical.
I don't know. I hear it's 7 figures, and
Probably north of $2 million, I'm guessing. Keep
I've
it
heard
to
that.
yourself.
I've heard that before.
Now, moving on, Walt, you own this 2005 Corvette. You owned a 64 originally. You had some other Corvettes in your career, but you've driven both these now back to back. What do you think of the 14? How do you compare the two?
Well, it's kind of like my life. We've both evolved over the years. I was excited about my 64 because of the big V8 engine. I loved the power. And so that's where I started off in Corvettes. The 2005, better in many, many ways. And I was looking forward to the 2014, the C7 here now. And now that I've had a chance to drive it and we've done cross country on it, I have to tell you, it's in every aspect, it exceeded what I expected out of it. And I have not found one thing that I could complain or say negative about it.
And the most important thing, Walt, is we convinced your beautiful wife, Dot, that she likes it too.
That is very important.
So I see one of these in your future, huh?
Yeah.
Well, I got to thank you both. It's been a great Corvette afternoon.
I appreciate it.
As we're leaving Ellington, Walt spots a T-38 supersonic fighter jet. You guys, when you're traveling around the country for your various training and setting up systems and meeting the manufacturers, you basically had personal use of one of these.
Well, we had 30 of them and 30 pilots most of the time. The Corvette here, the C7, latest, greatest, well, that was the good old days. Much faster and really made our life endurable because we had such a tough schedule all over the country. There were weeks when I had to spend time on both the East Coast and the West Coast. Never could have done it if we hadn't had those.
When Apollo 13 Commander Jim Lovell radioed, "Houston, we've had a problem," he radioed this place, Johnson Space Center. JSC is the home of astronaut training, especially Building 9, which today is filled with mock-ups of the International Space Station. Nearby is an Orion capsule, the planned follow-up to Apollo. Then Walt and I climb up into the cockpit of a shuttle systems trainer.
Back in my day, the command module was thought of as the most complicated piece of hardware ever to be operated, and we had 1,800 switches and other items that we had to be able to control and move and do. 1,800 seemed like a lot. Well, you can see that this is much bigger than that.
Imagine the biggest swimming pool you've ever seen, now multiplied by 10. The Neutral Buoyancy Lab helps astronauts simulate the weightlessness of space, allowing them to work underwater on full-size mock-ups of the International Space Station. This place is about as James Bond as it gets. Wicked cool. As one team of divers completes their shift, I meet Stacy, who's been working at the NBL for 15 years. And you're just there as a safety diver, helping the astronauts out, move around?
Yeah, our main goal is to make sure that they're safe, if anything was to happen, to get them out. But we also assist them with tools and heavy objects. And any task that they're on, if they need some help, they let us know.
Great. Well, we'll let you get back to warming up. Good talking to you, Stacy. Take care. For pure history, though, the ultimate site at JSC is the nerve center of the entire NASA space program, Mission Control.
Apollo 11 in Saturn gave us a magnificent ride.
3 days, falling upward to the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're in the original Mission Control Center at Johnson Space Center in Houston, and I'm not embarrassed to admit I get a little choked up being in here. This was ground zero for the glory days of NASA's manned space program. Every mission from Gemini 4 through Apollo was orchestrated here with some of the baddest ass engineers and specialists you can imagine, most of them in their 20s. When Neil Armstrong landed on the moon and said, "The Eagle has landed," Charlie Duke from right here said, we copy you down, Eagle, right here. It's an incredible place.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Those of you who watched Apollo 13, an excellent movie, you recall that it was at the flight director's desk right here where they heard the words, "Houston, we've had a problem."
Hey, Houston, we've had a problem here.
Right here.
Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
It's amazing. You can still smell the stale coffee and cigarettes and sweat in this place. The stuff that went on.
Yeah.
Just outside the fence at JSC lies a newly constructed hangar showcasing a fully restored original Saturn V rocket left over when NASA canceled the last 3 Apollo missions. Along one wall are pictures and profiles of the space heroes of Apollo, all friends of Walt's, many of them now gone. Just visiting NASA's historic sites has been a journey I'll never forget. But doing so in the company of Apollo 7's Walt Cunningham and behind the wheel of America's fantastic astronaut-approved speed machine, well, sometimes boyhood dreams really do come true. Walt, after the Apollo program, the follow-up program was the Space Shuttle. This is the Atlantis, and of course that program's over. How did you rate that program and success?
Overall, this vehicle, not this particular one, but amongst the 4 vehicles, they flew 135 missions. And I personally believe that it was the most amazing flying machine ever built by man.
Really?
I also think it was the safest machine ever used to put people in orbit.
Really?
Oh yeah. They did have 2 accidents, of course, but those were managerial decisions that caused that. When they quit flying this, I think it was a huge mistake, because we don't have anything to replace it now for maybe, it might be out of 10 years before we have our own. So-called commercial space may step in there and be able to do that. But in the meantime, Russians are taking us up.
You gotta get NASA back in there.
Yeah.
Did you ever wish you got a chance to fly one of these?
Oh, yes, yes. But you know, it would carry so many people. They probably wouldn't ever let me command it because I was just a Marine civilian reservist fighter pilot, you know. So they changed their requirements so different in there that I'd have been the right seat co-pilot probably.
Can handle that?
Oh yeah. I'd have done anything to fly on it.